This is our Brexit Watch podcast, looking behind the headlines on Britain's decision to leave the European Union. And one of the biggest questions being asked is what sort of trade deals might the UK have with the EU once it's left the club? There is so-called soft Brexit, which would leave the UK inside the single market and the customs union with the EU, but according to many EU politicians, that would mean Britain would have to continue to accept free movement of people, and that issue of immigration is thought to be one of the most important for voters back last June. So what would happen with hard Brexit, leaving the single market and the customs union? I wanted to find out more, so I spoke to Vicky Pryce, an economist at the Centre for Business and Economic Research. What would happen to trade in various sectors if or when the UK leaves the EU customs union? What about motor manufacture, for example, and agriculture?
Well, at present, the UK is part of the customs union, which is a sort of uniform acceptance of various rules, which include exporting to each other things that comply with various standards, whether it's environmental standards or technical standards. And also, of course, it means a common tariff with the external world. So if the UK were to leave that, then it will have to think about actually having tariffs with the rest of the world itself, and also tariffs with the EU, something that doesn't have at present. The worry about that, of course, is that will start restricting trade significantly and add also to costs of goods produced in the UK, which will make the UK more uncompetitive in terms of selling anything to the EU.
I had a look at the World Trade Organization schedules, immensely complicated, pages and pages of Excel spreadsheets. It's so different in different parts of the world, isn't it? The tariff that would have to be paid on goods crossing borders.
Absolutely. I mean, every country can decide what it wants to impose as a tariff for the products that it imports. But once it does, let's say whiskey in India, which actually has a huge tariff imposed on it for anything that comes in from the UK, for example, they have to impose the same tariff to everyone else unless there is some specific free trade agreement that they've come to negotiate with either a region or a country that allows for that tariff to be considerably lower. Without those agreements, then you just have to apply a common tariff for particular goods to everyone. Of course, every country differs in the goods in particular that they're concerned about and the tariffs that they want to impose, and hence why it is so complicated. But overall, with some exceptions, tariffs have been going down, which means that if you fall back on WTO rules, or rates, whatever it is that is out there, what you find is actually they're nothing like as high as they used to be for most products. But it would still affect some 90% of UK exports to the EU.
What about food, for example, meat, which is something that is exported by farmers in the UK into Europe? What might happen if if there isn't a negotiation, and okay, there will be one, but if there isn't, and we just fall back on WTO rules, then what?
Well, agricultural products vary again in terms of the tariffs that they have, but some of the products, if you look at WTO rules, average 50% tariffs. Actually, that's very, very high. So what is going on right now is that farmers are very worried about doing anything at all in relation to investing in expansion, in new plant and machinery type stuff that they need, because of course so much of what is produced here goes into food production afterwards and food processing, which is a huge industry in the UK. So if the costs of also importing go up and also the difficulty of exporting whatever you produce increases, then obviously that's not very good at all for farmers. But we have to also bear in mind there is an added complication. What tends to happen is that under WTO rules, there are also agreements in terms of the way in which particular products, let's say lamb from New Zealand, can enjoy low tariffs in a particular region, which could be different, for example, than what perhaps New Zealand charges for other buyers. But then those are subject to quotas. In other words, each country in the EU is given a particular bit of that quota. And of course, the UK gets rather a lot of lamb from New Zealand. And the question, of course, once you leave the customs union is how does that quota get reorganized? Do we lose it all? Do we have to renegotiate it with someone else, and at what price? So that actually might mean quite a substantial increase in the prices that we pay as consumers for our food in the shops.
Let's talk about the motor industry, because that's been one of the successes for Britain. They make parts of cars, they assemble cars, but a lot of those components move around Europe as they are made or put into different processes in the production line. So how would that be affected?
Oh, that's an absolute nightmare. I mean, indeed, we're doing rather well in terms of car production. But of course, we import a lot of cars as well, and we import a lot of components. But what happens in the process of assembly, not just necessarily the final car, but it could be still a part of it that is used in production all over the EU. It may enter EU countries and exit again, on average, something like 5 times in the production of this particular thing you're trying to put together, whether it's the final car or a part. It could actually be more, depending on what we're talking about. And if you're not in the customs union, every time this happens, one would need to make a declaration of what's in it, what the component has done in terms of being compliant with technical standards, whether, of course, something has come in from elsewhere that has gone into the production from outside the EU, and therefore has a proper tariff been paid, and also has it met the standards that are required for the EU. So it is actually a nightmare. And the motor industry is so interconnected, the supply chains are so important to ensure that you remain competitive, that getting rid of that, or at least adding an extra complication, just increases costs and reduces the attractiveness of the UK as a place to produce.
OK, fair enough. It sounds complicated, but one of the arguments made by those who are in favour of Britain leaving is that, yes, but the European Union needs us. Germany sends a lot of BMW cars to the UK. They're not going to stop selling those. They'll want to make it easy, and so these tariffs will not be imposed.
It is entirely possible that there could be a deal that allows the UK to be part of the single market, if you like. In other words, a tariff-free zone for particular sectors. The car industry being one, because, of course, the average tariff there is 10%, which would be actually quite significantly punitive for anyone who produces anything here, and, of course, for anything that we may be importing. I mean, that is a particular issue for cars, where, of course, indeed, we import an awful lot from Germany and others. But when you look at the overall share of exports, from the UK, we export some 45% of our goods and services to the EU. They export about 7% of their goods and services to us. So yes, perhaps individual countries like Germany are higher up the list in terms of the average that they export to us. So it's more than 7%. But overall, the Europeans are not really bothered with the market, in the sense that it's not as significant as other things that they can do and other places they can sell to. So we mustn't exaggerate our own sort of importance in the overall EU economy. We are significant, there's no doubt about that. And we heard all sorts of noises about the German manufacturers also wanting to make sure that we work very closely with them and there are no barriers, and perhaps some arrangement will be made. But because of this supply chain issue that we've been discussing, it's very difficult to see having a single market agreement in one area for one sector, and then not for everything that goes into the production process as well. And services, of course, rely hugely on what happens in the manufacturing side too. So my view is certainly that you can't just do single sector deals. You have to do deals for the whole economy, really.
That's Vicky Pryce, an economist at the Centre for Business and Economic Research, on the potential for trade deals and trade tariffs if the UK leaves the European Union Customs Union. You can comment on that on Twitter at BBC Dan Damon, and join us for more World Update Brexit Watch next Wednesday. And of course, our World Update Daily Commute podcast is every day.